The morning call to prayer has just faded over Multan, Pakistan, when religious scholar Syed Asad Abbas Shah's phone rings. On the other line, the steady, formal voice of a police officer. Syed's 20-year-old daughter has been found hanging from a ceiling fan in her bedroom. The word suicide hangs in the air between them. In a city where ancient shrines cast shadows over modern apartment blocks, where family reputations are carefully guarded behind high walls, some things are meant to stay buried. This is the story of Sania Zahra, a story that begins with a death certificate and ends with a DNA test. A story about a father's desperate search for truth, and a reminder that in places where power lives behind closed doors, the most dangerous lies are the ones we're expected to believe. Within minutes, Asad Shah and several family members rushed to Sania's residence to find out what had happened. The house was in Basti Bilal, a neighborhood in Multan, where Sania lived with her husband's family. When Asad arrived, he found an unsettling scene. His daughter's body was still there, in the upstairs bedroom. She was hanging by a dupatta, a long scarf, from the fan. Her father was grief-stricken, but also immediately something felt off to him. Downstairs, some members of Sania's in-law family were gathered, including her father-in-law and brother-in-law, and notably, they appeared unnervingly calm given the circumstances. They weren't wailing in shock or rushing about. They were sitting together quietly in another room. It struck Asad as strange. Why were they so composed while Sania was dead upstairs? As he moved closer to his daughter, Asad noticed other details that raised alarm. The room did not look neat or peaceful, as one might expect if Sania had simply decided to end her life quietly. Instead, there were signs of chaos. According to Asad, some glass objects in the room, possibly mirrors or windows, were shattered. There were indications of a struggle, as if a violent fight had taken place there. This was not what you'd expect at the scene of a calm suicide. Sania's body itself bore marks that disturbed her father. He later recounted that her jaw looked misaligned, possibly broken. He thought he saw bruises. Her eyes appeared bruised, and maybe her ribs too. Even her elbows had some injury. These could have been subtle or hard to confirm at a glance, but to Asad they were glaring signs that Sania might have been hurt before her death. And then there was the position of her body. He noted something about the way she hung that didn't seem consistent with a self-inflicted hanging. One detail he pointed out was that it looked like her feet might not have been fully off the ground. Typically, when someone hangs themselves, they drop and their body weight is suspended. Here it wasn't clear that it happened properly. From the very start, Syed Asad Abbas Shah could not shake the feeling that this was all wrong. This was his daughter. He knew her, and he knew the situation in her marriage. We'll dig into that soon. The scene in front of him screamed foul play. In his gut, Asad suspected that Sania had been murdered, and that someone had staged the hanging to make it look like a suicide. However, at that moment, the official stance was still that Sania's death appeared to be self-harm. The local police officers on the scene treated it as a suicide initially. They took statements from the family members present. Sania's husband, Ali Raza, was notably not at the house when Asad arrived. We'll get to his whereabouts later. But her mother-in-law and other in-laws were there. It seems they had informed the police earlier that morning when they discovered her. As per Islamic custom and local practice, things moved quickly toward performing Sania's funeral and burial. Despite his misgivings, Asad Shah allowed the formalities to proceed that day. Sania's body was taken down and eventually transported to her father's home once some initial legal formalities at the scene were completed. She was laid to rest soon after, with her family grieving an unimaginable loss. But even as they buried Sania, her father was already vowing that this was not the end. In his mind, this was not a simple suicide to mourn and move on from. He was convinced something evil had happened in that house. As he would later tell anyone who would listen, someone who commits suicide does not break things around the room. They don't smash mirrors or leave signs of struggle. They simply take their own life. And Sania's room, in his view, showed clear signs of struggle and violence. So, while the death certificate might have initially listed the cause as hanging, Asad Shah began mustering his resolve to challenge that finding. Over the next few days, his mission became to prove that his daughter had been murdered, and to bring her killer or killers to justice. Before we follow the investigation that unfolded, it's important to understand who Sania Zahra was and why her father was immediately suspicious of her in-laws. Sania's short life had not been an easy one, especially in terms of her marriage. Sania was only 20 years old when she died in 2024, which means she was married as a young teenager. In fact, she had married her husband, Ali Raza Shah, about 4 years earlier. She was around 16, some say even younger, 14 according to certain reports, at the time of her wedding. Essentially still a child. Ali Raza was a man from a nearby area, the son of a local figure named Jivan Shah. He was older than Sania. His exact age isn't stated, but enough to have had a previous family, which we'll get to, and he was introduced to Sania's family as an eligible bachelor. It was an arranged marriage, and given Asad Abbas Shah's status in the community, one assumes they tried to vet the groom's family. But unfortunately, the Shahs were deceived. Unknown to Sania and her parents, Ali Raza was not the unmarried, virtuous man he pretended to be. He had a secret. Ali was already married, and even had children from that first marriage. This was a fact he and his family actively hid from Sania's side at the time of the wedding. They falsified documents, even Ali's national ID card, to show him as single. And with that lie, he married the teenage Sania Zahra. The truth came out about 6 months after the wedding. Imagine the shock and betrayal the young bride and her family must have felt. Sania learned that her husband had a wife and at least one daughter, some accounts say 2 daughters, living elsewhere. Ali Raza had never divorced that first wife. He had essentially entered a polygamous marriage without informing Sania, which is both legally and morally reprehensible. In Pakistan, a man can take another wife under certain circumstances, but lying about it and forging documents crosses clear legal lines. For Sania, this revelation was devastating. Here she was, a teenager far from home, trying to adjust to married life, and she finds out her husband is a liar with another family. The situation quickly went downhill. Ali's true character began to show. He became abusive towards Sania. We don't have every detail of that period, but according to later statements from her family, Ali physically mistreated her. At one point, things got so bad that Ali actually sent Sania back to her father's home, effectively kicking her out, after a bout of physical abuse. Now, around this time, Sania was pregnant. She gave birth to her first child, a son, while staying at her parents' place, roughly 4 months after Ali had cast her out. By now we're likely in late 2020 or early 2021. After her son's birth, Sania did something quite brave for a young woman in a conservative society. She took legal action to claim her rights. She filed a case for maintenance, to make Ali financially support her and their child, and also to secure her hakmer dower rights from the marriage. An important part of that dower was a house that had been promised to her and actually written in her name. Yes, the house in Multin where Sania and Ali had been living was, on paper, Sania's property, as part of her marriage contract. That house would later become the crime scene, and its ownership is a key detail. So, Sania was fighting in court to ensure that Ali didn't rob her of her rights, the money for her and her child's upkeep, and the property that was hers. It seems likely that this legal battle caused a lot of bad blood between the two families. Ali's side, perhaps, hadn't expected her to stand up for herself like that. However, at some point, Ali Raza attempted a reconciliation. With the court case looming and his deception exposed, he approached Sania, who by then had started attending a local university, showing she was trying to build a future for herself and her child. He met her at the university and literally begged for forgiveness. He claimed that he had divorced his first wife, whether that was true or not is unclear, and that he wanted Sania to return to him. He swore he would never harm her again. Now it's easy for outsiders to wonder why Sania would even consider going back after what he'd done. But she was around 18 at this point, with a baby son. She likely felt immense pressure to maintain her marriage, societal pressure, family pressure, and her own hope that maybe things would improve for the sake of her child. Ali was her husband after all, and in her culture divorcing or remaining separated is a very hard path, especially for a young mother. Moreover, he had promised change, and perhaps she wanted to believe him, if only so her son could have both parents under one roof. So Sania agreed to reconcile. She returned to Ali Raza's home and resumed married life with him, bringing her infant son with her. For a short time it might have seemed like things would get back on track, and indeed, she became pregnant again with a second child. She delivered a second son, who was born about 9 months before her death, so late 2023. Sadly, and predictably one might say, Ali did not truly change his ways. After the brief calm, he went back to his abusive behavior. In fact, he became even more controlling. Sania's father later recounted that Ali completely cut Sania off from her own family once she returned. She was forbidden from visiting her parents or even calling them. At one point, Ali reportedly confiscated Sania's mobile phone so that she had no direct line of communication to her father. Sania's parents only found out about the birth of her second son a month after the fact, probably through indirect means, or when Ali's family informed them on their own terms. You can imagine how painful that was for Asad Shah, to be kept away from his daughter and not even know he had a new grandson until much later. By mid-2024, Sania was essentially trapped in an unhappy, and as it turns out, dangerous household. She had 2 little boys, one toddler around 3 years old and one infant under a year, to care for. She was likely trying to make the marriage work despite the abuse, perhaps for her children's future or due to societal expectations. But tension and resentment simmered under the surface. Ali had already shown what he was capable of in terms of deceit and violence, and now on top of that, there was an ongoing conflict over the property and money. See, even though Ali pretended to make peace, he still very much wanted control over that house and finances. According to Sania's father, Ali had been pressuring Sania to sell the house that was in her name and hand over the money to him. This house was a valuable asset, likely given by Sania's family at marriage, and Ali coveted it. Sania, to her credit, had refused. She would not beg her father for more money or relinquish what was rightfully hers and her children's. This refusal caused major fights between them. All these factors set the stage for what happened next. To recap her situation by early July 2024. Sania was a 20-year-old who had endured betrayal and abuse at the hands of her husband. She was living with him and his family again, trying to keep her marriage afloat, but things were volatile. She had a legal case likely still in process regarding her rights. She was essentially cut off from her own supportive family, except through whatever controlled contact Ali's family allowed. And she was possibly even expecting another child. There were rumors that she was a few months pregnant again, though official reports later said she wasn't. It's a point of dispute. What is clear is that she was under tremendous stress, and she was living with people who had proven they didn't have her best interests at heart. All of this is why, when news of Sania's supposed suicide reached her father, he did not simply accept it at face value. This wasn't coming out of the blue. There was a whole troubled history pointing toward potential foul play. Let's return to July 9th, 2024, and the immediate aftermath of Sania's death. Initially, the police, and perhaps even some extended family members, considered the possibility that Sania had died by suicide. On the surface, there were a few reasons one might lean toward that conclusion, aside from the stage scene. For one, as we just discussed, Sania's life was full of turmoil. Tragically, in societies everywhere, a young woman facing domestic abuse and isolation might reach a point of desperation and attempt to end her life. The circumstances can sadly fit. Moreover, in this specific case, Sania's in-laws were quick to put forward a narrative. They suggested that Sania was emotionally unstable due to recent family tragedies on her side. Here's what they pointed out, and this came up in statements later. They noted that Sania's own brother had died by suicide just 6 months earlier. This is true. Sania's younger brother had taken his own life not long before. Additionally, they claimed that Sania's mother, Asad Shah's wife, had a history of mental health struggles, even alleging that her mother had attempted suicide multiple times in the past. Now, we must be cautious here. These claims about her mother are unverified publicly and could very well be distortions or outright lies spread by Ali Raza to bolster the suicide narrative. But the point is, the in-laws were painting a picture that suicide runs in her family, trying to make it seem plausible that Sania too might have done this to herself due to genetic predisposition or learned behavior. At the time, the police had to consider all angles. When someone is found hanging and there's no immediate obvious evidence of foul play, suicide is the default assumption. So, an initial post-mortem examination was conducted on Sania's body to determine cause of death. This autopsy took place on July 14th, after her burial, meaning they actually had to exhume her body for a proper post-mortem, because presumably no thorough autopsy was done prior to burial. Yes, she was buried quickly due to religious customs. But once the family raised questions, a court ordered that she be exhumed for an autopsy a few days later. The preliminary autopsy report, let's call it that, came back with conclusions that, frustratingly for the family, seemed to uphold the suicide theory. The report noted that the ligature mark on Sania's neck was consistent with hanging, and that the cause of death appeared to be asphyxia, suffocation, due to hanging. Importantly, it also stated that the hyoid bone in her neck was intact, a detail forensic pathologists look at because a broken hyoid can suggest strangulation, though its absence doesn't prove anything conclusively. Additionally, the doctors wrote that they found no visible signs of injury or violence on her body. No mention of bruised ribs or broken jaw in that official report. It was as if the autopsy saw a completely normal hanging scenario. And to top it off, they confirmed that she was not pregnant at the time of death, so those initial rumors or assumptions that she was expecting were officially ruled out by the medical exam. From a medical examiner's standpoint, at that moment, there wasn't a clear smoking gun to declare it a homicide. The cause of death was hanging. Even if it was a staged hanging, physiologically, that's what killed her, unless she was strangled first. But if she was strangled by the same scarf and then hung, it could look very similar. There were no stab wounds, no bullet holes, nothing obvious. If she was beaten or tortured, perhaps the evidence was subtle or missed. Bruises might not show prominently if a body isn't examined closely, or if some time had passed, and if internal injuries existed, they might not have been apparent without thorough forensics. However, Asad Shah and his family strongly rejected the notion that this was a suicide. Asad was vocal and adamant. He told investigators and the media that his daughter's in-laws were trying to disguise a murder as a suicide, and that the crime scene itself contradicted the suicide story. Remember those broken glass pieces and signs of struggle he noted? He brought those up to anyone who would listen. He argued, for example, that a person who hangs themselves doesn't go around breaking furniture or mirrors first. Such evidence points to a fight, not a solo act of despair. He also pointed out, quite shrewdly, something about the mechanics of the hanging. According to Asad, when he saw Sania's body, it appeared that she had been hanging for many hours. He estimated over 14 hours. And yet some things didn't add up. For instance, he insisted that in a genuine suicide by hanging, the person's feet should be off the ground. If someone's feet, or even toes, can touch the ground, the hanging might not fully asphyxiate them, or they could potentially stand up, unless they were unconscious, or already dead. He believed Sania's feet were too close to the floor, suggesting she might have been placed that way after she was already lifeless. These are the kinds of details that deeply troubled him and made him accuse the in-laws of staging the scene. It basically became his word and suspicions against the initial forensic report. Not an easy position to be in, but he was determined. Asad Shah wasted no time in taking action. He went to the local police station, the New Multan police station, soon after the incident and formally lodged a complaint, an FIR, First Information Report, accusing his son-in-law, Ali Raza, and several members of Ali's family of murdering Sania. In his complaint, he named Ali as the prime suspect and also included Ali's parents, Jeevan Shah, and his wife, Sania's mother-in-law, as well as Ali's brother, sister-in-law, and sister. Essentially, he implicated the whole household, suspecting a conspiracy, or at least complicity in the murder. The police did register the case as a murder investigation under the relevant sections of the law, including Section 302 for murder. However, registering a case is just the first step. Initially, given the lack of obvious evidence, the suspects all managed to obtain pre-arrest bail from a court. This meant that even though a murder case was filed, none of the accused could be immediately arrested or kept in custody. They were legally protected until the police found solid evidence against them. One can imagine how distressing this was for Sania's parents. They're convinced who did it, they've named them, but those people are walking free, probably thinking they outsmarted the system. In fact, Ali Raza, the husband, appears to have been confident that he could weather this storm. He and his family stuck to their story that Sania tragically took her own life, and that Asad Shah was simply unable to accept it. Ali even turned the blame back around. In one public statement, a press conference he later held, he claimed that Asad Shah, his father-in-law, was blackmailing his family with false murder allegations. Ali brought up the point about Sania's brother's suicide again, implying that mental instability was the cause here, not foul play. He said in that press briefing something along the lines of, "My wife's brother committed suicide, and even her mother attempted it a few times. This is a pattern in her family." It was a cold, deflecting stance, essentially painting Assad's family as dysfunctional to save his own skin. He also described the events of the night of July 8th, the night before Sania was found, from his perspective. He admitted he and Sania had an argument that evening. Exchanged harsh words, is how he put it. After the fight, he claimed, he left the bedroom and slept in a separate room. Then, according to him, in the morning he came to check on her. The door was locked from the inside, and she didn't respond, so he says he broke the lock to get in. And that's when he found her hanging from the ceiling fan. He portrayed himself as a shocked husband, who then immediately called for help. To hear Ali tell it, he was utterly innocent, and this was a family tragedy being twisted against him. He also complained that the police, in the process of investigating, had harassed his family. He mentioned a raid on his sister's house that allegedly damaged property as they looked for him, since at one point he was not at home, presumably avoiding the initial arrest. But now, with bail in hand, he was bold enough to talk to the press and maintain his story. If you were an observer at that time, you might wonder, was the father seeing things that weren't there, driven by grief? Or was the husband lying through his teeth to avoid accountability? It was a classic, he said, she said, with the stakes incredibly high. This is where the case could have fizzled out, where another suspicious death might have been quietly labelled suicide and left at that. But fortunately, that's not what happened. Asad Shah was not going to let go. And soon, others started to listen to him. He found allies in the form of local activists, women's rights organisations, and even some prominent political figures who caught wind of the case through social media. Because as it turned out, photos of the crime scene and details of Sania's death started circulating online, posted by friends or activists under a hashtag Justice for Sania Zahra. The images, we can infer they showed Sania's body hanging in the state of the room, were horrifying and fueled public outrage. People began demanding a thorough, transparent investigation. By July 12th and 13th, the noise had grown loud enough that the provincial leadership took notice. Mariam Nawaz, a high-profile political leader in Punjab, personally reached out to Asad Shah to offer condolences and assured him that the investigation would be fair and complete. She dispatched officials to meet the family. A team including a provincial minister and Hina Parvez Butt, who is the chairperson of the Punjab Women Protection Authority, visited Asad at his home. This wasn't just a token visit, they actively got involved in the case. Under their watch, the names of the key suspects, Ali Raza and his immediate family, were placed on the exit control list, meaning they were flagged at airports to prevent any attempt to flee the country. The authorities were treating it seriously, which must have been a ray of hope for Sania's family. Additionally, a joint investigation team, JIT, was formed, combining police and forensic experts to dig deeper into what really happened. The Maltin police, now with extra scrutiny on them, couldn't just write it off. They had to gather evidence to either prove or disprove the murder allegations. Central to this effort was the involvement of the Punjab Forensic Science Agency, PFSA, in Lahore. The PFSA is a modern forensic lab that has been behind some breakthroughs in Pakistani criminal cases in recent years. The police collected forensic samples and sent them there. As mentioned, they exhumed Sania's body on July 13th, under court orders to get proper post-mortem samples, since the initial autopsy had been limited. They took swabs, tissue samples, and anything that could be tested for clues. They also collected items from the scene: the dupatta, scarf, that served as the noose, and scrapings from under Sania's fingernails, among other evidence. They even took DNA samples from everyone present in the house that day, including all the in-laws and even the household staff like servants or drivers, to compare with any traces found on Sania or at the scene. This was a thorough approach to not miss anything. Over the next couple of weeks, forensic analysts got to work. This would be the phase that ultimately cracked the case wide open. The PFSA ran a battery of tests: DNA profiling, examining the ligature, toxicology on organs to check if she was poisoned or drugged, etc. The outcome of this forensic investigation would finally provide clarity. The scarf used to hang Sania was carefully examined. Now, when a person hangs by a fabric like that, their full body weight usually causes the material to stretch or elongate, especially if it's a long scarf. Also, the knot tends to tighten severely due to the force. In this case, the forensic experts noted that the dupatta did not show the kind of stretching or strain that would be expected if Sania's full weight had been hanging on it while alive. In fact, at the scene, one forensic officer had even noticed that the noose was oddly easy to untie and loosen, an indication that it hadn't been pulled taut by a struggling living person. This suggested that the hanging might have been staged after Sania was already dead, or at least not conscious. They re-examined Sania's neck and found something startling. There was no swelling in her neck tissues. Typically, in a hanging death, especially if the person was alive at the time of hanging, the pressure of the noose can cause congestion and swelling above the ligature mark due to blood pooling when veins are compressed. Sania's neck lacked that expected sign. Also, the pattern of the ligature mark and other marks on her neck and shoulder didn't quite line up with how the dupatta would have caused them if she had hung herself. In essence, the forensic pathologists concluded that the marks on her body were not entirely caused by a straightforward hanging. They noted that the noose itself did not actually cause her death, implying something else did before the hanging was done. Remember how the initial autopsy said no sign of resistance? Well, the DNA tests told a different story. When they looked at the material from under Sania's nails, they found male DNA that matched her husband, Ali Raza. This is a classic sign of a struggle. Often when a victim fights back, they scratch their assailant, getting the assailant's skin cells under their nails. The presence of Ali's DNA there is highly incriminating, suggesting that Sania grappled with him, trying to defend herself. Perhaps even more damning, the forensic report revealed that both Ali Raza's DNA and his mother's DNA were found on the dupatta that was used to hang Sania. This means that both of them had handled that scarf. Now, one might argue, Ali's DNA could be on it just from being around each other, touching clothes in daily life, etc. But the mother-in-law's DNA being there is harder to explain away innocently. It strongly indicates that she was involved in using that dupatta, likely helping her son stage the hanging, or even participating in the act of strangling or hanging. The forensic experts also looked at the whole picture, combining the lab results with observations from the scene. The mention that Sania's jaw was broken, that there were rope marks on her feet, bruises on her body. Those details had been cited by the father in the FIR and might not have been fully acknowledged in the first autopsy. With the body exhumed, these could be reassessed. We know from various accounts that indeed there were indications of torture. For example, one report, via the family, said her teeth were broken and tongue cut, though it's unclear if the official forensic exam confirmed the extent of those specific injuries. What is clear is that the final analysis stated unequivocally that this was not a suicide by hanging. All the forensic signs pointed to homicide. To sum it up, the Punjab Forensic Science Agency's work essentially validated Asad Shah's suspicions. They found zero evidence supporting suicide and plenty of evidence indicating murder. A senior police officer later stated, "All the tests and investigations show that it is not a case of suicide. Sania Zahra was killed on July 9th and her murder was presented as a suicide." That's a direct quote from the officer in charge after reviewing the forensic findings. Imagine the relief and vindication for Asad Shah at hearing those results. After fighting against doubt and perhaps even ridicule, science had come to back him up. His daughter had been murdered, just as he thought, and now he had proof. The investigators didn't stop at just identifying that it was murder. They were closing in on who exactly was responsible. The DNA evidence pointed squarely at Ali, the husband, and his mother. Polygraph tests were also conducted for what it's worth. Both Ali and his mother underwent lie detector tests and reportedly both failed or showed deception. Now, polygraphs are not admissible as hard evidence in court usually, but it's another piece that reinforced the guilt. Hina Parvez Butt, from the Women Protection Authority, even said publicly that after seeing crime scene photos she already had a hunch. But with the evidence and polygraph results, it was clear the husband and mother-in-law were involved. One more thing investigators uncovered around this time. Ali Raza's web of lies was even thicker than initially known. During their inquiry, they officially documented how he had faked his marital status. They found the forged identity documents where he claimed to be single at the time of marrying Sania, even though he was legally married to someone else then. This was serious fraud, so separate charges were prepared against him for forgery, cheating, and bigamy. These charges were important because, as the murder case was still being built, they provided an immediate reason to detain Ali, who had been free on bail. It turned out Ali had never really divorced his first wife. He simply hid that marriage, so he had two wives concurrently, one of many lies he lived. As the forensic evidence came to light, Ali Raza's narrative fell apart, and the case swiftly moved toward action. Here was a man who thought he could lie and scheme his way through anything. He had done so in the past with his marriages. But now reality was catching up with him. By late July 2024, Ali had initially secured bail in the murder case due to lack of evidence and was out free, loudly proclaiming his innocence. He even tried to gain sympathy by going public, claiming he was the victim of false accusations. But behind the scenes, the police had filed that second FIR against him for the fraud and bigamy charges. This is important. On July 20th, the Malton police quietly registered this new case, sections of law dealing with forgery of documents and concealing a previous marriage, etc. With that, they got the legal grounds to apprehend him again, despite his murder case bail. On July 21st, Ali Raza decided to hold a press conference at the Malton Press Club, likely to try one last time to sway public opinion or assert control over the narrative. He repeated his story, that Sania committed suicide because of her own family issues, and that his in-laws were unjustly accusing him. Little did he know, the game was up. By that date, the police already had the PFSA report, or at least enough preliminary findings to know the truth. They were just waiting for the right moment, possibly to avoid any confrontation or chase. As Ali was wrapping up his media talk, a police team arrived and took him into custody right then and there. Imagine the scene. One moment he's denying everything on camera, the next he's being led away in handcuffs. The evidence had spoken louder than his words. With Ali under arrest, attention turned to the others involved, especially his mother, who, according to the forensic results, had a physical hand in the crime. She and the other family members who were named by Asad Shah had initially been on interim bail as well. But now that the case was clearly a homicide, their fates would depend on further investigation. We know at least that the mother-in-law underwent a polygraph and was implicated by DNA on the ligature, so it's logical she too would have been arrested or at least charged subsequently. Our records emphasize Ali's arrest. They don't explicitly state if and when the mother-in-law was detained, but given the evidence, the authorities certainly considered her a suspect as well. At this point, let's reconstruct what likely happened on the night of July 8th and early July 9th, based on all the evidence and testimony, because understanding the crime itself will tie together why each piece of evidence was so telling. On July 8th, 2024, Sania and Ali had a fierce argument. The topic could very well have been money or the house. Recall that Ali had been pressuring her to sign over or sell the house, and she had been resisting. It might also have involved jealousy or control, but finances were probably front and center. During this fight, things turned violent. Perhaps Ali attacked Sania in a rage, and she tried to defend herself. She scratched him, hence his DNA under her nails, maybe on his arms or face. At some point, Ali's mother, who also lived in the house, got involved. Was she trying to stop the fight, or was she aiding her son? The evidence suggests she participated in subduing Sania. Given the cultural context, it's sadly not too surprising that a mother-in-law might side with her son, even in something extreme. We've seen cases where women family members become complicit in honor killings or domestic violence. Here, maybe the mother-in-law helped hold Sania down or restrain her. Sania was then likely strangled, possibly with that dupatta, or maybe by hand or a pillow. The forensic report didn't conclusively say manual strangulation, but something caused her death before hanging. The broken jaw and other injuries reported by the family indicate severe force was used, maybe punches or blows that could even have broken teeth. It's horrifying to think about, but it seems Sania endured a brutal assault. She died from this violence, whether by strangulation or a combination of trauma and asphyxiation. Now Ali and his mother had a dead body in their home, a huge problem. They decided to cover it up by making it look like Sania did it to herself. Perhaps they thought that given her brother's recent suicide, people would accept that narrative. So they staged the scene. They took that same dupatta and tied it to the fan, and then hoisted or positioned Sania's body to hang from it. In doing so, they left their own biological traces on the scarf: sweat, skin cells, etc. They may have also wiped things down or tried to tidy up, but clearly they didn't or couldn't clean up everything, like broken glass or signs of struggle. Maybe they thought no one would notice or care, or they were in a rush. One detail from the scene: a chair or bench was found in the room. Ali's family might have set it up to imply she stepped off it to hang herself. However, an observant visitor noted that it seemed unlikely Sania, who was not very tall, could reach the fan even with that bench, which cast further doubt. It was as if the staging wasn't even logically consistent. After staging it, Ali needed to create an alibi or at least distance himself. According to his own story, he claims he slept elsewhere that night. In reality, maybe after killing her, he left the house, or at least the room, and only discovered her the next morning to fit that story. We know he actually fled the scene sometime after, because he wasn't present when police first came. Perhaps immediately after calling the police about a suicide, he made himself scarce, fearing arrest. By the time Sania's family arrived at 9 a.m. and the police were there, Ali was not around. He later admitted he wasn't there when they arrived, which is telling. What husband wouldn't be at the scene if his wife truly had just killed herself? His absence was suspicious. It appears that on July 9th, when authorities first responded, they might not have treated the home as a heavy-duty crime scene, since they believed it was suicide. Evidence collection initially may have been minimal. But after Assad's insistence, law enforcement had to circle back. So Ali laid low for a while. Perhaps he thought if the autopsy says suicide, he'd be safe. And initially it did. He might have felt triumphant when hearing the first report showed nothing obvious. But he didn't count on the persistence of Assad Shah and the power of public outcry pushing a more in-depth probe. Once the forensic results implicated him, his bluff was done. The police, armed with science, could now confidently call this a murder and him the culprit. Ali's mother, as mentioned, was also implicated. She likely faced arrest or at least charges. Ali's father and siblings who were named, their level of involvement is less clear. They might not have physically participated, but if they helped cover it up or lied to police, they could be considered part of a conspiracy, hence the initial charge of unlawful assembly and rioting with deadly weapon, which is a bit strange. Those particular charges might have been a way to include all family present as culpable, or maybe suggesting they intimidated someone or planned it together. Those details would be sorted out in trial. For now, by August 2024, the case had transformed. It went from maybe suicide to confirmed murder with evidence. With Ali Raza in custody and forensic evidence on file, the wheels of justice began turning in earnest. The case gained a lot of media attention in Pakistan, even if not much internationally. Every development was followed closely by both social media activists and news outlets. People were horrified by what happened to Sania, and there was immense public pressure to ensure the perpetrators faced the full force of the law. Sania's father, Syed Asad Abbas Shah, became something of a public figure through this, speaking out about his daughter's case and against domestic violence. His steadfast commitment to uncovering the truth earned widespread respect. Many empathized with him. He had not only lost his daughter, but nearly saw her story get buried under a lie. Thanks to his efforts, that didn't happen. The case underscores a few important things in the bigger picture. First, it highlighted the issue of domestic abuse and honor-based violence in a segment of Pakistani society. Sania's case is sadly not the only one where a husband or in-laws have tried to pass off a murder as a suicide. But rarely are these attempts exposed so thoroughly. The fact that forensic science was effectively used here gave hope that others like her might also get justice if investigations are done properly. As one official said during a press conference about this case, the era where murders could be disguised as suicides to avoid detection is over. They wanted to send a message that you can't so easily cover up a crime now. Evidence will speak. Secondly, this case showed the power of social and political will. If the local community and media hadn't raised their voices, the case might have languished. But once it became a high-profile matter, the authorities acted decisively. Punjab's government officials directly intervening ensured police didn't drop the ball. There's a bittersweet aspect here. Justice came, but it required loud advocacy and some influence. Ideally, every case should be investigated so well, not just those that get public attention. Still, it set a precedent. Now, what about the legal outcome? As of the latest updates, which are towards the end of 2024, Ali Raza and likely his mother and any others charged were headed to trial for Sania's murder. The evidence against them, as we've discussed, is substantial. We are talking DNA evidence, forensic pathology, witness statements of the suspicious scene, and even Ali's own contradictory statements. It's hard to imagine a court acquitting him with that kind of case built. In Pakistan, murder can carry severe penalties, up to and including the death penalty, especially in a case as brutal as this. One twist in Pakistani law is that the victim's family has the power to pardon the murderer in exchange for compensation, blood money, under Islamic provisions in the law. However, given Asad Shah's pursuit for justice and how he went to great lengths to prove the murder, it's highly unlikely he would pardon his son-in-law. In fact, he was publicly calling for the strictest punishment. There was a significant grassroots campaign with people demanding that Ali and his mother be punished. So the pressure remains to see this through to a conviction. Sania's two young children are now with her side of the family. These little boys, one barely a toddler and the other still an infant at the time of her death, will grow up without their mother. That is a profound tragedy that no justice can fully remedy. One can hope that they are loved and cared for by their grandfather and other relatives, and that they will be told the truth about what happened to their mother when they are old enough. Perhaps they will draw strength from knowing she fought for their future, even in her last moments. For Sania Zahra, justice means that the people who betrayed and killed her will face accountability. In a broader sense, justice also means that her story has led to greater awareness. She has, in a way, become a symbol in Pakistan. A symbol of why women's safety in their own homes needs to be taken seriously, and why forensic evidence is so crucial in solving crimes objectively. The case is still moving through the legal system. Trials in Pakistan can take time, but with the evidence so clear, it's likely only a matter of procedural steps. There's confidence that the truth will prevail in court, just as it did in the investigation. As we conclude this story, it's worth reflecting on the key takeaway. If not for a persistent father, a proactive investigation team, and forensic science, Sania's fate might have been written off under a false narrative. Her case teaches us the importance of questioning superficial explanations, especially when our instincts and the circumstantial evidence tell us otherwise. It also teaches that no one should be above the law, not a husband, not in-laws, no one. And that with evidence, even the most cleverly attempted cover-up can be torn down. In the end, the perpetrator in this case, who we now know was her own husband, was unmasked. Ali Raza, the man who once swore to protect Sania in marriage, turned out to be the monster she needed protection from. And he almost got away with it. But thanks to a combination of love, science, and justice, he didn't. Thank you so much for listening. If these types of rarely reported solved global murder cases interest you, please consider subscribing. We very much appreciate it. We'll be releasing 2 compelling episodes a week, and we're just getting started.